meeting. So I'm starting that now, and I'll make that link available to PUC staff to do with as they please. Hopefully this time I won't get kicked out of Zoom. I'm talking to you today from Puget Sound on the east side of Commencement Bay on what may be the not too distant future of the port of Tacoma. So maybe I'll have a better signal up here. But thank you all for making time today. I'm very, very much looking forward to today's conversations. Last week was wonderful to get some context. Been tracking and really excited with a lot of interest in the work that our national labs have been doing, specifically in the offshore wind space with funding from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. That excitement is not only about what we're learning about the more immediate opportunities that offshore wind may hold for the state of Oregon, but also in general to see what type of modeling and assessment and resource valuation is available, and that we have the potential to apply both in terms of synergistic resource and load values, locational values for significant resources of this size. And without further ado, I'm going to pass things over. In the original agenda, I believe we had an hour for both, well, originally we had an hour for PNNL, but fortunately, we were able to split the time between the Pacific Northwest National Labs and NREL, who recently, I think 2 weeks ago, published some more recent work on offshore wind and the transmission implications. So I'm going to hand the meeting over to Drew and or Travis, Team PNNL. You should be able to share screen. Let me know if you can.
Okay, I'll give it a shot, Shannon. Is that coming across at all? And then let me put it in screen sharing mode or the actual presentation mode. And you could, if I get a check that looks okay.
Yep, perfect.
Yep. Okay,
that
great.
Looks good.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks everybody for joining. We're excited today because not just because of to talk to you all, not just because of the two studies themselves, but also because this is an opportunity, maybe the first opportunity we've had on this particular subject to kind of demonstrate the scientific method here, where we have multiple researchers from different perspectives with different tools analyzing the same problem. And perhaps that's when we take multiple bites at the apple, that's when we can really start to see, coalescing results and have some more confidence in the findings of any one study. So that's one thing I'd like to say to frame it up. But we're going to go pretty fast because we want to cover both. And so we're going to start here with the key findings, and then Drew and I will present the two major pieces of our study, which was done in the spring of 2020. Those being production cost modeling of the Western Interconnection and specifically Oregon transmission networks, and then also some resource complementarity, kind of teasing out capacity value of this emerging resource, particularly south of Coos Bay and north of Eureka, California. But key findings of the research, just one slide on this right up front. We found through our work that regional transmission networks can today have the capacity, the technical capacity to carry between 2 and 3 gigawatts of offshore wind with minimal transmission enhancement required. We also found that offshore wind power flows, so importing, even though the grid did not evolve to do this and was not designed to incorporate large amounts of energy from the ocean, the incorporation of offshore wind across the Oregon coast relieves historic transmission flows and provides several benefits, freeing east to west transmission, which may assist additional variable renewable energy transmission from the eastern side of the state, and then also serving coastal loads north and south. We find that offshore wind naturally complements loads better than terrestrial wind in the Northwest. And we know that we have quite a bit of wind onshore, so that's interesting. There's actually a kind of a natural matching to the load trends that seems to be superior across various seasons, but overall seems to be better. And then finally, there's complementarity, some natural correlation with other emerging and existing already interconnected clean energy generation. And that's valuable as we think about where the state and the region is going in terms of clean energy grids. So as I said before, two major sections of our study. The first that we'll talk about today is the production cost modeling, which was led by Dhruv. And then once Dhruv presents those results, which I think are particularly relevant to the conversation to follow, then I can talk a bit about some of the capacity value that we found. So over to you, Dhruv.
Thanks, Travis. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Everyone, Dhruv Nagar with Pacific Northwest National Lab. Thanks for having us, and happy to join the conversation, and looking forward to presenting our results and engaging with you all on sort of what they mean and how we take it forward. So Travis, please feel free to jump in, any thoughts, and Marty too. I will say the NRL team, Marty and Josh, followed, like Travis said, a little bit different, but also there's some similarities. So I'm going to maybe highlight where some similarities and differences are as we go. But I think that the two sort of studies together kind of give a pretty neat picture of kind of the modeling space and what we've done. Getting into it, we used ABB's grid view production cost model. This was for those of you who may not be familiar with production cost modeling. Basically, it's a representation of the grid, all of the generators, loads, buses, major transmission, and basically what it does, it's a linear mixed integer linear program that basically solves for dispatch of resources to meet load requirements every hour over the year. And the objective function is primarily lowest cost, but also there's constraints on reserve requirements and other things that it looks at or that it incorporates. So the case that we used is the WEC anchor data set case for 2028. This was available as of July 2019. Basically, the WEC put this case together, so it is with industry, with utility input in particular, and industry input. So it is, at least from case, available cases, it is at least the most, as far as we know, up to date at the time, case that was out there that we used. There's a newer version, 2030, and I think now they're working on a 2032 version. Those are basically just updates to the different expectations of generators and such. So at a high level, we ran it at an hourly resolution each hour of the year for 2028. And the model of 2028, actually, we were having this conversation with Marty and Josh the other day, is actually fairly similar to current status 2020. I think one of the criticisms of the WEC case is maybe it's not that aggressive. So it's actually somewhat similar to what a current situation is, which gives a good sort of representation of deployment of offshore wind now. And then Marty's going to talk about a future case where they did some capacity expansion planning to think about what it looks like out in 2036 with a bit more renewables deployed. So I think that's a good contrast. Okay, just quickly, regional hydro units in the case are modeled without any contracts. So we don't consider the PUD contracts. Hydro is instead set as a load falling resource. So some of those nuances of contracts and transmission availability don't get captured because we're not looking at that availability subject to contracts. We're just thinking about the pure physics of what's available and what's not. Next slide, Travis.
Is it too many? There we go. How's that? Is it coming across?
Oh, you're good. Yeah, the
Okay.
transition is just it's funny. So quick highlight on what the case does, and we looked at between 2018 and 2028 the changes. Mostly just includes all of the installed capacity up the West Coast, and actually the capacity additions in particular in California for distributed generation. That's a big change. In Washington and Oregon, relatively minor, some addition of renewables, I think. Again, which is why I kind of highlighting that it's pretty similar to status quo 2020, 2021 situation. Although we haven't directly compared it, but I think that's our guess. Next slide. And I will note that, so in terms of transmission, when it's projecting out to 2028 or even the new 2030, 2032 cases, any additional transmission, they only include what's past transmission queues. So if it's in a transmission queue, it doesn't get included. It's what's approved and will definitely be constructed. So when we ran the model, what we did was we deployed offshore wind in increments of 1 gigawatt on the Oregon coast at 4 different sites. And actually, I think the next slide will show where those sites are, basically up and down the coast. And as you build out offshore wind, you can see in the table 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Of course, you have generation cost savings. When we model it, we don't provide. There's no fuel price for offshore wind. There's some O&M, but it's fairly minor. But of course, you're going to have generation savings if you're displacing. In this case, we're displacing natural gas and coal generation. So you have generation savings, diminishing returns up to 5 gigawatts, as you can see. Brings down what the model does is it calculates LMPs, even though we don't have a formal market up here in Oregon and Washington. It does calculate LMPs and basically showing you're bringing down average costs across the system. And then you have significant carbon and other emission savings because of that displacement of traditional fuels. Another thing we did is we had a separate study around the same time where we were looking at a large-scale deployment of electric vehicles and using production cost modeling to evaluate that. And so if you have the 3 gigawatt plus EV at the bottom, if you have a big deployment of EVs, you can see there's quite a bit of value in the offshore wind as well relative to it gets the generation cost savings when you're using offshore wind to charge those EVs is significant and a little bit more than without that EV load. Now I'm realizing it's not 85 to 89 is not that big of a delta, but the LMP delta is quite big. Slide. Oh, thanks. So the offshore wind locations we looked at were Port Orford, Reedsport, Newport, and Astoria. And this is just to look at capacity factors at peak hours. Here we're looking at gross capacity factors, so not counting in for losses. But across, so the graph is indicating resource capacity factors on average across the year by month. As you go further south, your capacity factors get better, as you can expect with what we've classified as better wind resource further south. And when you're looking at system loads, so in the table, morning peak is Oregon peak load, evening peak, Oregon peak, and then WEC system wide. Particularly for the Oregon peaks, you see some pretty strong gross capacity factors, up to 62% at Port Orford, which really sheds some light on the value that the offshore wind resource presents as a capacity resource for Oregon. This is particularly in light of if we're starting to retire fossil units and such, we will need those capacity resources, of course. And here we can show that offshore wind can play a role in that. So this is the map on the right, highlights the 4 locations that we picked, we built out offshore wind equally in each location for the different cases that we ran. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There were equal distributed amounts of offshore wind in each of those spots. For those spots, we identified 230 kV BPA substations that we could interconnect to. And assumed an interconnection to those substations from that offshore wind resource. As we did that, you can see curtailment by deployment location. As you increase your deployment of offshore wind, you of course see more curtailment indicating, there's only so much the electric system can accept. But at 2 gigawatts, we see a very minimal curtailment. At 3, we're starting to get into 10 to 20 to 30%. And so one of our key findings of the work was that between 2 and 3 gigawatts of offshore wind could be accepted on the system with minor curtailment without any major transmission upgrades to the system. I think Marty will go into their work, but they found, I think, somewhere in the same span, 2.5, and they kind of narrowed down a little bit more discreetly into that number. So one of the differences between our work and theirs is we kind of we did kind of spread out the offshore wind resource and pick substations, and I think they were a little bit more methodical in looking at the onshoring of that load, and they'll get into it there. But for a sort of a high level sort of representation, you can see that there's potential for quite a bit of offshore wind to be accepted on the system without new transmission investments. Getting into the locational value. So we looked a little bit, we looked at the cross cascade transmission lines. And basically this one, this specific one is, so coastal transmission loading from Northern Oregon. We're looking at the transmission line, Clatsop to Alston, to Keeler, and basically I won't really dive into the numbers, but what you see both, relative to normal operations versus 3 gigawatts of deployment is both at median and at peak. You change direction of the power flow and send a lot of the power rather than power being delivered to the coast for the loads. Power is being delivered from the offshore wind turbines into the coastal, into load centers in Oregon and into that I-5 transmission corridor. Slide. Similar results down south. So we're looking at just north of California at some of the VPA substations, 230 kV substations down there. And we find similar sort of change in flow patterns. Going from, rather than going from east to west, we see a big shift going from west to east, both median and peak. Really highlighting that you're serving the local loads with the offshore wind, and then excess energy is being sent over the coastal transmission into the major transmission corridors, and kind of along. Rose, you have a question?
I do. Can you hear me okay? Oh boy.
We can hear you.
Great, thanks.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Okay, so my question is just how close to the capacity of the lines do you know are the reverse flows in this example?
That I'm honestly not sure. I don't know, Marty, did you guys look? You guys looked into that a little bit more.
Sure, yeah, and we didn't look as much into these specific lines, so I'm not sure if you're asking about these or just in general reverse flows. I'll get into more in my presentation about one particular corridor, and we do see some interesting reversals and some kind of nuances as to like the timing of flows and offshore wind, but yeah, these particular coastal lines, we generally, once we add offshore wind, it's all going west to east back from the ocean. So I guess that's all a reversal. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if it's helpful, Rose, we could look those up and get back to you on that.
I think maybe my question is partially answered by the kind of curtailment numbers from, and am I right in understanding that those are times when BPA has to curtail the offshore wind because of the transmission system?
So when I guess I don't know if BPA's and so in our case, when we're doing the modeling, it's not any entity that's curtailing the system. It'll just be the system. It needs to be curtailed to meet load. So I wouldn't say BPA specifically, but yeah, you're right. If BPA is the balancing authority in much of the coast, that would be them. But I think that's right, to accommodate existing generation, but also transmission limitations both.
Got it. Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay, Drew, do you need more time on this one, or are we gonna?
No, I think we can keep going.
Okay.
Yeah.
And maybe Drew, if I can hop in on this one quickly.
Yeah, please go for it.
So, folk, just one slide on, well, I guess on the right here, we're pulling some really, maybe they're somewhat dated estimates as to the approximate BPA interconnection capacity across the coast. Although these have been vetted more recently than the dates here show. Probably there's room for a more refined study of the capacity that's available. But looking, there's a fair amount of capacity, and it seems to be relatively stable and hasn't changed much over the last few years, indicating there's lots of opportunity, lots of places to put this power in, potentially, and distribute it, the benefits across the coast. But we wanted to make a couple observations about modern wind turbine technology. It might be different than if folks haven't been tracking at this level of detail. There's a lot of things electrically that wind turbines can do these days. They're not just stall regulated, only when the, only providing active power, for example. There's of course, there is a benefit to distributed active power injection for frequency response and stability on these coastal networks, but it's also reactive power export capabilities, fault ride through. So if there's any kind of contingency event or failure of a particular part of the network, these turbines could help reinforce coastal grids and keep them online and operating per specifications or per the desired characteristics electrically. And that's something that maybe if you went back, 10, 15 years, it was harder to find wind turbines that could do that. But that's well within the realm of what technical capabilities are today. And these specific characteristics have been demonstrated at utility scale across the wind park by CAISO and Avangrid in 2020. And then there are also some additional resilience benefits that we postulated in our study: avoided cost of outages, reductions in backup systems, serving loads on the coast, including disaster response loads. And then we wanted to mention black start, which is there is a kind of another technology nuance there, but actually I was just reading the other day that 1 year ago, Scottish Power Wind Park with Siemens direct drive permanent magnet generator wind turbines, so kind of the latest and greatest technology, were able to demonstrate, actually it's not just a paper study, but actually demonstrate on a utility scale wind park a black start capability. So if we were in a really, hopefully that doesn't happen, but if we're in that situation in the future, these turbines could facilitate black starting and re-energizing the grid. Technically possible. There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of detail to design that capability, but that's within the reach of this technology. And then, of course, we mentioned serving coastal loads, and it's just an order of magnitude, kind of approximate. 1 gigawatt up and down the coast roughly gets consumed. I think Marty and Josh looked at that a little bit closer. This mostly came from BPA feedback, but something to consider that there is reduced power transmission needed to the coast. So back to you, Drew.
Travis. So I talked a little bit about the sort of the localized coastal transmission, but we also looked at paths, major transmission paths. So path 5 is the transmission path basically going across the gorge, kind of John Day Dam into Portland Load Center. And what we see, and this is average flows across the year by hour. What you see is as you increase offshore wind capacity on the coast, you start opening up transmission capacity in that path. I think Marty will get into a little bit more nuances at peak periods at different hours of the day. But as a general statement, overall, on average, you're opening up that transmission capacity to potentially import renewables from further east, say from Wyoming or from Eastern Oregon or Washington. So there's some what you would call transmission non-wires value associated with that offshore wind deployment. Next slide. See something similar coming from Idaho into Oregon on path 14.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Idaho and Oregon into path 14. Again, opening up transmission capacity because you're serving some of those Oregon loads with the offshore wind. Next slide. And then finally, south on paths 65, which is at DC Intertie from John Day Dam, and then path 66, which is the Koi transmission pathway on sort of on the I-5 corridor. A little bit of change, particularly in peak hours on average on path 65, the DC Intertie. You're opening up some space, but you don't see, it's not the same level of change as maybe we saw on the other paths, indicating that much of that energy is being used within Oregon and maybe Washington and not being sent down to California, at least up to 3 gigawatts. Glenn?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Drew. So quickly here, because I know we want to make sure we get to Marty's stuff here. So this is going to be kind of fast, but and I apologize, I'm happy to take questions later. We did run a variable renewable energy generator study as part of this work a little over a year ago. And we considered these VRE that are shown on this image, so some Wyoming wind sites, which are traditionally highly energetic, low cost of energy, terrestrial wind resources. And then also a lot of folks know about the Columbia River Gorge wind, a lot of folks on this call, I'm sure, and Southeast Washington wind resources, but also emerging Central Oregon and Southern Oregon solar. And I heard on a BPA call the other day that they've got 10 gigawatts in the queue, maybe 11 now, of solar, utility scale solar generation. So that's certainly an emerging source of variable renewable energy in the region. We wanted to consider, how does offshore wind play with these other resources? So we ran these complementarity or correlations on hourly basis across the seasons. So these images might take some getting used to. We don't have a ton of time, but I'll try to walk you through them quickly. So going from the upper left and then clockwise around, you've got December, January, February, then March, April, May, the spring, September, October, November, fall, and June, July, August, summer. These are hourly correlation calculations, which are averaged over all 6 years of data that we could extract from the Wind Toolkit. And then they are compared, the correlations are done in each sub box of the matrix between the site that's shown in the row label with the site that's shown in the column label. So if you see the really dark blue right along the diagonal, that's because the correlation is perfect. The hourly correlation is perfect of a single site with itself, right? And the lighter blue means a little less perfect. As you get to kind of that blank color, that means there's really no correlation. And then you go into the reds and you get into negative correlations. So what we'd like to see, and what you hear sometimes people talk about, oh, the dot curve, and wouldn't it be nice is when the sun goes down and PV stops generating, that the wind picks up in those shoulder periods and kind of fills the gap. So that's a negative correlation and anti-correlation. And so we kind of watch for those when we look at this resource complementarity scan. And what we find, so we're looking for reds really, or reddish colors. And I should say these are hourly correlations that are averaged over really many hours, right, over 6 years and entire seasons. So the best you're going to get. I mean, I think the best, solar energy production to load in the summer months, which you would think would be one of the best hourly correlations you could probably see inherently. The numbers are around a positive 0.4. So that just to kind of level set you don't really see these really high values given how many hours we're averaging here, but it still helps indicate maybe some natural inherent capacity value to the various resources when they're compared with each other. So three conclusions that are kind of highlighted in the kind of the dotted outlines on these. The first is that there's some negative correlation between offshore wind and the Columbia River Gorge terrestrial wind in the summer and in the fall. So that may hold some value in terms of allowing our hydro system to operate a little bit differently, maybe not used quite as much to balance some of that variable wind generation in the gorge. There's some natural kind of complementarity there. The transmission networks could help take advantage of. The second conclusion is that offshore wind could complement Oregon solar to help meet the regional peak loads that happen in the winter. So there's some, if you look at the winter plot, there's some orangish color there between the offshore wind sites and the southeastern Oregon solar and central Oregon solar locations we considered. The third conclusion here would be that offshore wind does not complement solar as well as terrestrial wind does in the summer. So it's not all rosy, right? We're not just gleaning positive attributes of offshore wind. There are some instances where it's maybe inferior in terms of complementarity. And then we did the same thing, but this time we appended the hourly characteristics of the balancing authorities inside, which have territory in Oregon State. So Portland General Electric, BPA, Pacific Core West, and Idaho Power Treasure Valley balancing authorities. And so those are in the final 4 rows. They've just been appended basically to these. So you really would just, for new conclusions, would just scan across those final 4 rows in each of these subplots. But again, and this is also just 2012. So now we're just looking at 1 year, but same seasons, still hourly correlations. 3 conclusions. The first being that solar load complementarity exceeds that of all other VRE. As I said, 0.4 is about as good as it gets when we do these averages over an entire year. The second conclusion would be that offshore wind may help balance loads during regional peaks driven again by heating. So those heating loads in the winter, there's a positive correlation with load between offshore wind and load that seems to be superior than with any of the terrestrial wind resources, for example, over here in the winter. And then in the summer and spring, there also is a positive correlation where offshore wind may complement load better than terrestrial wind. So that seems to be kind of a conclusion that is seen in most seasons. So all that to tease out some capacity value. One last thought, which is that we also tested this idea of offshore wind being, sometimes I refer to it as a hot take, that offshore wind is more consistent. You know, the wind flows over the ocean. There's a smoother boundary layer. You know, there's less thermodynamic variability. You know, we found that was true in some instances. So I should say, it's more consistent than land-based terrestrial wind resources is usually the take, and that is true in some cases. For example, we found that to be true when comparing Port Orford directly, which actually was quite similar to the other offshore wind resources in terms of its rampiness, so its change in wind speed over a limited amount of time, in this case 15 minutes. So change in wind speed meters per second over a 15-minute interval. Port Orford was similar to the other resources, but offshore. But when we looked and compared it to Wyoming wind locations, which again, highly energetic, leading levelized cost of energy, but also somewhat turbulent resource, somewhat peaky, we do see a pretty statistically significant benefit here of offshore wind requiring potentially less balancing reserves to operate a system reliably. So we'd like to tease that out a little bit more in future work. I'll just note that when we ran this same histogram comparison to other locations onshore, we did not see this sort of an offset. So the orange histogram being shifted to the right, showing higher absolute ramp rates for Wyoming wind than offshore wind. We did not see that in the Columbia River Gorge, for example, where the histograms were pretty much on top of each other. And this is taking 1,000 samples of 24-hour durations in different locations. So it is repeatable. So you've seen the key findings. I'd like now to hand the ball over to Marty and let him share what he's done in this, and he and Josh, I should say, in this really exciting work they have just released. Oh, and Rose, I see your question. You know, Rose, I wonder if we could take it quickly, unless that hand is up from before and I missed it. But if you could hold it until Marty can talk, that would work too. But why don't you tell us what you're interested in first?
Sure. It was just a quick comment that I would be interested to see that chart about load correlation with net load correlation.
Yeah.
Minus renewables.
Yeah, thanks. We would too. But yes, thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. And I think Marty might have something on that too.
Yeah, we have some stuff with coastal net load that might be interesting to you. So we'll let's see if that answers your question. Okay. I'm on one screen today, so hopefully this works. Share.
Looks good.
Okay, is this coming through okay?
Yep.
Great. First off, I just want to say, well, thank you to Shannon for setting this up, and thank you to Travis and Drew for partnering with us essentially with all this. And it's really exciting to talk to all of you important people from PUC and from ODO and other stakeholders, because that's what makes my job feel worthwhile. So it's really nice to be able to talk to you all about this, about our results. So move the screen over here. So yeah, so we completed a production cost model, just like Drew was mentioning. And because they were relatively similar scopes, I want to just call out some key connections so that we can then talk about how we complemented their study instead of just repeating same things. Although on the subject of repeating, it is helpful when two studies come to the same conclusion. So I'll start with common findings. So we both found that the existing coastal system can support between 2 and 3 gigawatts of offshore wind without significant curtailment. And because they had already done that full sweep of the 5 gigawatts, we were able to drill down on the specific maximum penetration and found about 2,625 megawatts of offshore wind could fit without causing serious curtailment or congestion on those coastal lines. And I'll get into our method for how we distributed capacity around the coast to maximize the existing transmission infrastructure to achieve that penetration. Second finding is we also found that offshore wind can reduce transmission flows in Oregon. Although we focused a lot on coastal lines, but not so much on the rest of the Western interconnection. So we didn't look at south of Alston or that PDCI down to California. We mostly focused on that P5, that path number 5, that represents east to west cross Cascade range transmission. And I'll also get into why we chose that particular pathway and the nuances of our results for that pathway. Then a few key differences in our methods. So PNNL studied the near term or really existing grid 2028 system. So we ran a few reference scenarios for the existing system, but we also built out a future grid infrastructure that was generated by our in-house capacity expansion model. And so the main characteristics of that future system is that there's much higher penetration of land-based renewables, fewer thermal resources. There's the thermal resources that are there are more efficient, although higher gas prices and all these other predictions for the future. And of course, there's higher load. So few key differences that by the time this offshore wind gets built, we might see differences in the grid. And the key difference number 2 is that there's been a large effort between NOAA and other national labs to come up with an updated resource data set specifically for offshore wind that's generated from improved wharf runs. And in general, these report higher wind speeds across the entire coast. So we had different input assumptions for our offshore wind. Next. So we had 8 findings in our study, and this is born out of the fact that we were able to vary other grid parameters outside of the offshore wind penetration. Although for the sake of time here, and just staying on message, I'll just focus on the first 5 as they're the most, these are sort of our key takeaways, and the rest were additional pieces in the paper. And just really quickly on our methods. So Drew already gave a great explanation of how production cost modeling works, so I don't need to go into that too much. But just to highlight our resource data sets. So these are common across most of our large scale grid integration studies. So we have high resolution wind data, onshore wind data in this wind toolkit. And we have the National Solar Radiation Database that has very high resolution solar data. And we have a relatively well vetted topology representation for all of North America, as well as hydropower resource information that is informed by historical EIA data on plant level for hydropower resource. Of course, that's very relevant for the Northwest, and we did some sensitivities based on hydropower resource. Now, the one difference here is that our offshore wind actually uses this new data set, and that map is shown in the upper right here. So I think this pattern is probably familiar to lots of people on this call here, where we see much, let's see if I can get my laser pointer up. Not used to zoom. Okay, there we go. So yeah, we see a lot higher wind resource on the southern coast, Northern California coast. So this is the new wind data here. The map down here shows the difference between the new wind data and the old wind data and from the wind toolkit, and we can see that across the board it's higher. So this led to some more. It's a little bit more optimistic about what offshore wind can provide. On the left here, it's just highlighting that data was validated by actual buoy measurements, and it's on an hourly basis relatively accurate. Okay, so all right, now my laser pointer is causing issues. So one piece we were able to accomplish after, as a complement to PNNL study, is that we could highlight a few key. Oh, I can't advance my slide. I'm just going to turn this laser pointer off. Sorry, let's take this laser pointer. Okay, so we were able to vary more of the aspects of the grid because we only looked at a few key offshore wind penetrations. So we had 0 gigawatt base case, and then we had the kind of maximum 5 gigawatts. And then in between, we had this 2.6 number, which I'll illustrate on the next slide of how we came to that number, but that essentially represents the max penetration that can fit on the grid without causing coastal congestion. Then the second dimension that I mentioned was the WEC infrastructure year. So we did study the current grid, which is about 22% wind and solar penetration by generation. And then this future system, which may or may not be more representative of what the system will look like when the offshore wind is actually commissioned. And that has a higher, about 46% penetration by generation. The next scenario dimension we studied was the upgrade of these trans-coastal range transmission lines. So as I mentioned, we saw congestion, or both we and PNNL saw congestion above 3 gigawatts. So we decided to increase the thermal limits of those lines to try and reduce that curtailment and see what would happen to the grid if we were able to transport all of that offshore wind energy into the rest of the Western interconnection. Now, number 4, we can't really talk about high penetrations in grid integration studies without mentioning storage, because of course it's the key piece here. So we ran a scenario where we included 100 megawatt storage units at each of the offshore wind interconnection sites. Now, this was not a storage study in particular. There's been plenty of that work from our colleagues. So we don't have robust conclusions from the storage. We just have a few pieces to highlight. And we wanted to cover our bases with storage, but there's a lot more work that would need to be done as for optimizing sizing and duration of that storage to best complement the resource. And finally, and this is something that we're starting to do more of in our grid integration studies, we highlighted 7 different historical weather years for select scenarios. So our base weather year is based on 2012, but in order to study the impact of various levels of water availability and different load shapes and different, onshore wind patterns, we ran some sensitivities for 7 different weather years and had some interesting ranges from there. This is really just a reference slide to show you the names of our scenarios and how they match up with those different scenario dimensions. For the purposes of this talk, I'll mostly just focus on the future, so the FG, so the future grid scenario, these 6 different scenarios here. And then I'll sort of march through these different dimensions and show how they affected our results. So starting with our offshore wind penetration here and how we got to this 2.6 number. So this map on the right should be familiar from the previous talk. This is a very simplified representation of the coastal topology in Oregon. And on the left here is we superimpose that offshore wind resource. So with the help of BPA transmission engineers, we first identified coastal substations where we would connect these offshore wind generation. And I think some of these are actually the same as what PNNL studied, so Clatsop, Tillamook, and then we had some differences down here. But in general, it's a sparsely populated coast, as everyone knows, and there's not really that many high voltage transmission lines. So that made matching these relatively easy. And we had 5 different sites that we matched to 5 different coastal substations here. And just a little caveat here, these sites, this was not a site selection study. We just took these directly from a previous cost study from NREL that did some more work on that. And so these, we're not claiming as these as the best sites or anything. We were solely using those to generate representative offshore wind profiles and then see how it's affected everything in the grid over here. So we're focused on grid impacts. So part of how we arrived at this 2.6 number was we worked very closely with BPA engineers to drill down on the thermal limits of these lines, both in summer and winter seasonally, and continued scaling up generation at each of these substations until we started to see congestion on these lines. And then that was right kind of where we hit the limit. So what we found is this is the max nameplate capacity. So here, going from north to south, that can fit at each of these substations without causing significant congestion on these trans-coastal lines here. And in general, it was relatively straightforward because the only high voltage transmission from each of these substations goes from the coast across the range into the I-5 corridor. The exception here is these two middle sites here. So both this Toledo and Wenston substations. And there was a little bit of kind of ambiguity of how much to place at each. And in order to resolve that, we used the heuristic to just favor any site to the south because it has higher capacity factor. So that way we could increase the total energy from all offshore wind because of the higher capacity factors down here. So we ended up doing is scaling down the load at this Toledo substation so that it would only support local load in Newport, and that would free up energy from the Wenston substation to utilize both of the paths to the I-5 corridor and then maximize this higher capacity factor site further south. So when you add all those together, we got about 2,625 nameplate max capacity that can fit utilizing this existing infrastructure here. So that was our first finding, and it matches very well with PNNL, so that was exciting to us. Second finding here has to do with the value of offshore wind. And this you can consider sort of our headline figure here. It summarizes the value of offshore wind from several different value streams. So the value streams there are operational value, capacity value, and then emissions reduction value. So moving up from the bottom of the stack up to the top, starting with this blue box here, this represents the value of avoided fuel costs. Then this thin orange line here, this thin orange box represents the value of reduced VOM costs from thermal generation. And then finally start and so just these two. There is a green box for start and shutdown cost, and it actually is negative. So there's a tiny little sliver down here because when we have more variable offshore wind on the system, there's actually slightly more start and shutdowns of our gas generation. But so there's actually a negative value there, but it's so tiny, as you can see, it's hardly noticeable for most of those. So the second kind of value stream that we added on here was the value of avoided capacity. And for this, we did a similar net load approximation analysis to what PNNL was describing earlier, where we looked at the performance of offshore wind from a capacity factor perspective during these peak net load hours, and averaged that capacity factor and then translated that into a firm capacity number. And then using this assumption of about $190 per kilowatt for gas capacity, we could translate that firm capacity number into a total, into a dollar value in dollars per megawatt hour. So that's what this red box represents. And then on top of that, we have value of avoided emissions. So this falls directly out of the avoided fuel costs. So we have avoided emissions in each of these scenarios, and using a social cost of carbon of $51 per megawatt hour, which we drew from the White House recent briefing from, I think, February of this year, that we found that on top of that, we got some more value out of offshore wind here. And just for reference, this big blue arrow is pointing to, I'm not sure, it might be a little hard to see, this yellow dotted line represents the average LCOE of offshore wind as determined by our colleagues in another study. at NREL, and you can see that in general, the total value stack exceeds the LCOE. Now, just a little nuance here. There's lots of assumptions that go into these value stacks. So there's the cost of gas generation. There's this assumption of social cost of carbon, which is of course kind of a softer assumption. It's based on a lot of harder to define things. So depending on those assumptions, the relationship to the LCOE can change a bit. But in general, you can see it's on the order of magnitude and generally far above that LCOE. One more piece to mention here is that as we go from CG current grid to future grid, we see this operational value decrease a little bit. And that's because in the future grid, offshore wind is competing with more renewable resources that don't have, that have zero marginal cost as well. And there's also just less thermal generation on the system. And the thermal generation that is on the system is more efficient. So in general, offshore wind is displacing less fuel. And so there's a little bit less operational value there. But you can see that it's still pretty significant. And it's still very much present. Okay, so that was our value stack. Sorry. Now I'd like to talk about curtailment. So Travis and Drew showed a really nice table showing kind of that inflection point of between 2 and 3 gigawatts where curtailment of the offshore wind shoots up. And again, we drilled down on that 2.6 number and then looked only at 5 gigawatts for curtailment. So our lower two penetration scenarios by design had very little curtailment. So what we're showing here is only that 5 gigawatt scenario, this high offshore wind piece, and looking at different pieces, different levers and how we can reduce that curtailment in different ways. So the blue bar here represents the curtailment we would expect to see if we did not increase coastal transmission lines and we didn't use any storage. And you can see that it's relatively high. So the bar here represents percent curtailment as a percentage of available capacity. And the red box here shows the total energy that would be curtailed. So kind of lost opportunity energy here. Now, when we add 100 megawatt storage units at each of those interconnection points, we see curtailment reduced by about 15%. So this suggests that storage, co-located storage, could play a nice role as a non-wires alternative, but the ability of it to reduce curtailment is a little bit limited. So there still is significant curtailment with the batteries. Now, again, this is based on a single sizing of batteries, and we haven't optimized the size or duration. So surely we could probably reduce curtailment further with different batteries, but this wasn't strictly a battery study. So I just wanted to show that it has potential there. We focused more on transmission. So then the third box here is rather than add storage, we just increase the thermal limits of those coastal lines such that they could, at every hour of the year, accommodate all of the offshore wind power. And we see curtailment reduced to essentially zero or near zero at all of these 5 sites. So this suggests that the congestion among those local coastal lines is the main driver for curtailment. And if we're able to upgrade those, then we see very little curtailment. So essentially, as long as we can get the offshore wind across the coastal range into the Willamette Valley, then it can maximize its value to the rest of the system. Okay, so now speaking of transmission, this is our next finding. And this comes directly out of what was shown previously on this transmission reduction. And here we're focusing on just the east to west cross cascade range transmission interface. And the reason for that is in our original statement of work and our original research question, we wanted to investigate the extent to which offshore wind on the western coast of Oregon could displace the need for shipping power all the way from eastern Oregon, from Idaho, Wyoming, those sites that Travis showed on that map. So that, those high capacity factor wind sites in Wyoming, different solar sites around the sunny eastern part of the Northwest. Most of that power right now flows through this cross cascade interface, this P5 pathway. And if we could add wind on the other side, then potentially we could reduce the need for that pathway. So here on the top, we see a scatter plot that it's plotting reduction in that exact pathway against the total offshore wind injection at the same hour. And you can see a very strong, linear relationship. As offshore wind injection increases, we see less and less flow along that line. And that matches very well with what we saw before from those diurnal curves where the average was reduced. Now, a key difference here is that we are not just interested in flow at all hours. In order to talk about deferral of upgrades or ability to serve as a non-wires alternative, what we're really interested in is the high flow hours. So periods when P5 would need this additional generation most. On the other side is when it's flowing highest and may be congested even. So that's what this bottom set of box and violin plots shows. We split up hours of P5 flow into these different bins. And this is P5 flow without any offshore wind. So this is in our reference scenario where, what is this? How does this interface operate in the existing configuration without offshore wind? And this is actually across all 7 of our study years. So that's why there's more than 8760 hours here. So we split these up into different bins. So from 2 to 3 gigawatts flow up through the highest bin of 5 to 6 gigawatts flow. And this is all east to west flow. And then what the violin and box plots represent is the distribution of offshore wind generation during those same hours. And you can see that unfortunately, as we look at higher and higher flow periods, the offshore wind availability is actually less and less. So this suggests that offshore wind is not actually available when P5 needs it most. And the extent to which offshore wind can serve as a non-wires alternative, at least for this particular pathway, is limited. So we don't have any evidence, at least from our end, to suggest that offshore wind would help defer transmission upgrades or save costs on additional transmission along that pathway. Now, a further caveat here is that more investigation into the reliability, using a reliability model would really be necessary to answer this question in full. So this is all just based on cost optimization, production cost modeling, and it's not based on stochastic reliability modeling, which is really what would be required to determine whether offshore wind is dependable enough to reduce this flow or to avoid transmission upgrades. Okay, this is their last slide. Maybe before I see a hand up, can't see the name, but would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, this is Brittany Andrews. I can wait till you're through this slide.
Okay, yeah, I just have this is the last one. So there's been a lot of talk of how offshore wind can support coastal resilience, reliability. And upfront, I just want to highlight again that this was not a study of the reliability of the system. So production cost modeling very much, it answers a lot of questions, but it is very, want to be very clear that it does not provide any evidence. It doesn't talk about reliability, right? That is a totally separate modeling question. But we can make some approximations. So we can still get at this question kind of in a first order. And from that, we just, as a first pass, we can just look at the coincidence of offshore wind profiles with coastal load profiles. And that's what this table represents here. So if I flip back to that map, you would see that most of these coastal substations are relatively isolated from each other, at least from a high voltage perspective, right? So their main connection to the broader grid in a high voltage line is across that coastal transmission. So we found all the coastal load nodes around each of those offshore wind interconnection points, and then compared that total load profile on an hourly basis to the wind availability at the same time, and found hours when the local coastal load exceeded its associated wind generation. And so those were hours where offshore wind could not provide all of the same load, even though it's directly connected there. And that's how we came up with these servable load numbers. The range here represents the 7 years, so the max and min from that 7 historical data years. And you can see that offshore wind can serve, the vast majority of coastal loads, but not all of it. So there's still more that needs to be done, whether it's from storage or potentially from continued imports from the I-5 corridor. So yeah, that's about all I had. I see 2 hands. I'd love to get into a discussion now. Yeah, that's just to put my thank you slide up. And yeah, I guess Brittany, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll kick it off. So that was great information. There was a lot of it. The second to the last slide you were showing with the violin chart, was the P5 examined relative to the different locations? It looks like this is just the total amount of offshore wind at those locations instead of saying what would the core, because I noticed in that graph early on, the southernmost wind had a different hourly shape. And so I was wondering if you guys looked at just the south part separately for that part, or if you plan to do so. Sorry.
Right. No, for this part, we didn't break out individual sites because this corridor was on the eastern side of the I-5 corridor. And we actually chose the scenario here where there is very little curtailment. So essentially these distributions of offshore wind represent the maximum that would be injected. So there's not really anything lost, and it's all mixing on that I-5 backbone there. So no, we didn't break it out. This represents all of the offshore wind together.
So intuitively, it seems like that different shape, that shape with more output in July could have more value relative to the grid issues than the northern. Am I thinking about this wrong?
No, that's if you're looking at just the southern shape, that's correct. And this actually, I should mention here, this is just from June through September. So this is when we have this is just the summer hours, and that's because the BPA considers those coastal lines to have a lower capacity during those months because of line sag due to heating and other factors.
Okay.
Although I think because all of the offshore wind is being added together here, this is the most optimistic point. So this would be everything that's available from all of the offshore wind at every hour, and it still doesn't coincide as much as we'd like. And because we're talking about the highest percentage of flow hours, we also want to be conservative, and the reason it's limits, so you can still see the mean here is just about 2 gigawatts, which is a significant amount of availability. But we looked only at, I think, the 5th percentile here to capture most of the hours, because when you're talking about resilience, when you're talking about reliability, it's really, it has to be in almost all of the hours that you can count on, not just the majority of them. So I would say
No, go ahead.
I would say another caveat against when you look at an average curve that looks, oh, the southern side did look better at certain hours. That's still an average. And what is really important is to look at the worst hours, So again, the plot on top here is sort of an average when you look at this line. And on average, yes, offshore wind reduces P5 flow, but what really matters is those peak hours, those highest risk hours, not just the average diurnal. So,
and I won't dominate here, but last question is in that. So going back to thinking about those hourly output shapes across the year, or I guess they're monthly shapes. Is there a way to consider and maybe you already showed a chart like this, the variability at the different sites? Like, is there more, maybe you did have that chart, sorry. This is great stuff. I'm getting myself a little too excited.
No, it's okay.
Thank you.
It's okay. No, and maybe I should let Travis and Drew speak to, since they showed those curves
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
If we
about
could just look
variability
at
at each
those
site.
again.
Yeah, I think, well, that was actually, I can stop sharing my screen if you like. But if you read our paper, we do have a few plots that show the variability at each site, just from a
Okay.
resource perspective. I'm so used to Teams. Let's see. Oh, stop share. Okay. I don't know if you want to bring those up for a second, or we
Yeah,
can move
so
on.
yeah, we can bring them up quickly. Sure. So Brittany, you were asking about those correlations.
I just thought it was so interesting how the southernmost had such a different shape across the year than the others, and trying to figure out how that interacts with the grid impacts.
This is the capacity factor shape, maybe, Drew.
Mhm.
The monthly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
I can pull that up real quick while you talk, Drew.
Yeah, well, I'd say, I mean, there's a couple elements. Those are the old wind resource data set versus there's that newer one that Marty, you guys use.
Yeah, true.
So there's one element there. Brittany, it might be interesting to run that across several years with the new data set too, and see how it looks, because that's a good point. I mean, you would think, just anecdotally, you would think, why does it look so different? Yeah, especially the I guess it's the colors that kind of I think the top one is Port Orford.
That's Port
The
Orford.
other three kind of follow the same
Yeah.
trajectory, but in the summer months, Port Orford jumps up quite a bit, especially. But I think there's also, I mean, the winter resource is stronger versus the summer resource, and it's possible that Port Orford stays stronger through the summer too. I don't know, Marty, do you guys have any insights on that?
I mean, isn't that the months that we have a lot of those problems on the flows?
Sorry, let me get back to. Yes, and I think there is opportunity there, but it's, again, because it's hard to look at averages and make any strong conclusions that, the capacity factor could be high in July because it's really high during hours that P5 is flowing at 2 gigawatts, where it doesn't actually matter. So I think it's more important to subset those high flow hours, and that's when we look at those, we see a lower capacity factor.
During the high flow hours, particularly, right? Yeah.
High flow hours, particularly, and it is a good point. We haven't actually looked at the high flow hours of the southern site only during those same high flow hours.
Well, if you do that, I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank
Okay,
you.
great. Yeah, we can catch up
Good
offline.
suggestion.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's a lot of potential diving in to be done.
There's always more to look at. Yeah.
Okay, are there any other hands up for this portion?
I see one. It looks like Matt.
You have your hand up? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'll go ahead and lower that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Team National Labs, as always. Very informative.
Shannon, this is Jason. I actually had a quick question. This is just going to expose my ignorance. But when we're talking about the capacity, the coastal capacity, we're always talking across all five lines. Some of which I think are 230 kV, some are 115, maybe 3 and 2, or something 4 and 1, something like that. I wonder if the wind resource is better in the south, and our expectation is the first projects will likely be further south. If you did do an upgrade to a line and you dramatically improved, let's just say money was no issue, and you put a 500 kV line out of Coos Bay, is one line upgrade adequate to move larger amounts of power? Do you have to somehow, depending on where the project is, upgrade that local cascade or coast range line? Does that question make sense? Could you do all your improvements in one line down in south, really focus your money and attention there, and ignore the others? Or is this an issue where you've got to upgrade all your lines?
Yeah, so Jason, you're talking about getting power to that one big upgrade down south somehow, right? And if the transmission or the existing transmission on the coast itself could accommodate power for different points to that point.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I can speak to that for a second. I would say in a world where you could put unlimited offshore wind in one location, you would probably just put it all in the south and then make a huge 500 kV line to bring it all to the coast. But we were we were somewhat limited by other constraints from a previous study that looked at other ocean uses and sort of maximum technical potential at each call area. And for that reason, right, I think it's more, you're more limited by how much you could actually fit in the ocean and then bring it, rather than the transmission. There's no like real grid reason why you would have to upgrade the other lines if there wasn't power being injected there. But yeah, I think it would depend more on how much you could fit in from the actual generation side.
Okay.
And if if you even ignore that, I think the north-south transmission on the coast itself is probably not that robust. We didn't dive into it, but just looking at the high voltage transmission maps, there's not that much there. So I think you would be challenged to bring power down to one line too, even if you could build out.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
All
That goes
right.
for alternative. Oh, sorry. I was gonna say alternative transmission. A transmission backbone on the coast or on the water, for example, or on the coast or something.
Or
So
down
those
to
are all-
California.
Or down to California. Those are all potential considerations.
Yeah.
So much work to do. We need that big federal infrastructure, renewable energy funding package, please. A
Yeah.
long list of work. Well, I'm going to run through my presentation very quickly because I want to make sure that we leave the full half an hour for Jason at Odo. My name is Shannon Souza. I wear many hats. This presentation is from the perspective of Oregon Coast Energy Alliance Network. We've been looking at this opportunity specifically with a coastal lens on just what it could mean to us. This is the beautiful coast that we're talking about, putting steel in the water in. We are located, we're really based out of Coos Bay and south, though increasingly increasing our conversations to the north up toward the Newport area. We do promote frontline load shaping or frontline project shaping of our clean energy transition. And we're going to talk to you about how we're doing that and how we see some differentiation in the consideration of the timing and uses of offshore wind with that perspective. So why do we even care, and why are myself and all of our board members donating so much of their time to this? We live out here on these in these little islands, these islanded load pockets. All of our energy comes through constrained transmission lines through very catastrophe prone routes. And as our FEMA Region 10 director likes to say, that Oregon's coast is subject to every catastrophe known to people except for locusts and lava. We also are in a region that is economically impoverished while it is absolutely resource rich. There's a lovely book that was written about kind of our history of boom and bust down in the South Coast. We share this amazing world-class resource. We've just learned that it's even more world-class than we thought before. With California, they're a bit ahead of us in BOEM's process, yet they have some significant barriers that they're trying to work around, most notably in the Northern Call area. And we've been ocean collaborating with some of our friends down in the Eureka area about this. They've got an even more limited transmission network capacity. So at Ocean, we kind of divide our work into education and advocacy. I'll talk briefly about those. Our friend Bill Henry, who's on the line here, came up with this diagram during his graduate work at PSU. Here's the traditional project proponent model. That's the federal process certainly follows this. The industry and developers get together in kind of closed huddles, figure out what it is that they can build and move forward in the process. And it's not until you get to that permit triggered EIS period where you have real deep engagement with those stakeholders that will be most deeply touched by these projects. So not getting in the way of that traditional process, but what Ocean is doing is leaning in as hard as we can to simultaneously engage as many of those who will be most deeply touched by this project now, while the concepts are being drawn up. What does that look like? In our organizational structure, we have board seats that are designed for representation for those diversity of coastal interests that will be most deeply impacted. And in our membership structure, Oregon Coast members are the ones ultimately that elect and serve on our board. And if there's some kind of a lack of consensus in our policy deliberations, they are the ones who vote what our positions will be. We were very interested in and served on the Technical Advisory Committee for a recent study that was published last June, specifically intended to inform Oregon's policymaking. It's Oregon's Clean Energy Pathways. There's a link to that report. And as you'll see there, and this was before we passed House Bill 2021, Oregon's offshore wind looks very likely to emerge as a balancing force to the WECC, while it's producing a lot of clean electricity for green hydrogen via electrolysis, that green hydrogen to further decarbonization of industry, our ports, maritime, agriculture, and transportation. What we see here, though, is this is not going to occur until this rapid investment period of 2035. And the statement that we have at the top here is that without state leadership, and if we're not including resilience or economic development into our planning around clean energy, this offshore wind is not likely to be triggered until it is as a response to the needs of our neighboring states, and potentially without much Oregon stakeholder shaping at the onset. So from Ocean's standpoint, some of our comments as those that are using the findings of this study to produce further studies looking at Oregon's decarbonization pathways, as well as conduct a decarbonization pathway analysis for the Northwest Planning Power Conservation. These are some of our comments that we would like to see. These are programmatic changes or systemic changes to how we think about things. We'd like to include community level resilience in our energy infrastructure. For us, loss of load means loss of livelihood, absolutely. That means our point of sales are down, we can't refrigerate our food, we can't communicate with each other. It happens all the time. In some cases, that loss of load can mean loss of life. So energy is necessary for us. Communities that are served by nearby resources are less susceptible to transmission interruptions. And since our resource adequacy modeling is based on a 1 in 10 that is aggregated for the entire state, it does not reflect the resource inadequacy that is often experienced at the end of the line. We'd like to see the evaluation of impacts of access to the clean energy economy. Clearly, the communities that are near resource development have some direct economic development opportunities. And it does, resource modeling does not incorporate the economic benefits of this direct resource investment. So what would that look like if we actually captured that? Evaluate the economic impacts. We know that specifically out on the North Spit in Coos Bay and other places within the state of Oregon, that significant industrial and economic development has been thwarted by a lack of access to reliable energy. And that certainly has economic impacts to us. So what are we doing about that? We're running with a coexistence by design model. We are trying very hard to support an informed and engaged coastal citizenry so that they can make decisions about our own energy, economic, and cultural features. What does that look like? Oftentimes we have meetings like this, they're during the day, there are proceedings and plannings and rulemakings. They're during the day when folks that don't engage in the energy sector don't have time to participate, and maybe they don't understand what the implications are to themselves or even think that they care. So Oregon's or Ocean's engagement plan is something that we're considering in situ. Let's go to where the folks are already meeting and congregating and having conversations. We did a test with one of our local service groups, a youth service group, to say we don't want folks that are out there actually advocating for some specific project. We are advocating for coastal clean energy access. And we think that our youth that are currently serving in Z clubs and K clubs, and they're looking for projects and they're looking for activities, are perfectly served to this purpose, to actually set up booths with information, get information out to folks, and take some feedback and additional questions back in. We also like to go to where are these conversations occurring. This is actually a solar powered with battery backup location down in Coos Bay, that's Seven Devils Brewing, where we developed sipping civilly. You know, if you're like us, oftentimes you go to the watering hole and that's where you have the conversations. And we decided to kind of take an old French salon format approach to this, pick a topic that is particularly controversial and have a nicely facilitated, peaceful conversation about that. Based on the success of last night, the offshore wind drinks in Portland, Ocean definitely shared that with our coastal contingencies, and there was a lot of interest to replicate that out here on the coast. And what we would like to do, definitely Representative Brock Smith was excited to take that up. So we're going to be pulling that together for a first one that will occur in January down in Coos Bay. And we're specifically collaborating with those entities that don't have this direct drive advocacy for offshore wind, but whose members want to know more about it. So that would be Surfrider, Audubon Society, Fishing Families of Charleston, and down here, the Oregon Institute of Marine Biology. So talking to lots of people and try and keep up that good work. We are membership driven, so we're always looking for more members. Step two was, okay, let's get some kind of organization at the state level around planning for this. What does it look like? So thanks for all of the wonderful work from many, many, many people. And thanks for the leadership from Representative Brock Smith on the call. We did pass our House Bill 3375, which does set a new precedent. Certainly in the nation, we haven't heard of any planning bills that were specifically designed to maximize benefits to the state while minimizing conflicts between other users, the ecosystem. Noteworthy that this was unanimously passed off of the House floor. So this is definitely an inclusive approach, and it is not a directive to construct, but it is a directive to better understand this opportunity and how we might shape it up. So now that we have a captive audience and we've got some strong leadership coming out of Odo to head up that process, we are advocating for the development of specifically of planning scenarios that do assess the socioeconomic impacts of 3 gigawatts, unlike the Clean Pathways work that does not assess that socioeconomic impact. And specifically, what we'd like to do is work with those that are most deeply impacted in this first phase of that scenario development, then conduct the socioeconomic analysis, work with our economic developers, the industry on all of the extensive supply chain opportunities and workforce to figure out what that looks like. And then take that into some ratepayer impacts of these various scenarios and develop some recommendations that could be considered as paths of least conflict for developers to consider as they're putting together their proposals in response to lease inquiries. Specifically in the case of our coastal fisheries, we're really interested in work that was recently published by Pacific Marine Fisheries Management Council. They took a look at the scenarios that were impacting our fisheries up until 2040, and they developed factors, and developed 3 scenarios. The scenario that Ocean is really embracing is this one. As the fishing industry resurged in the 2030s, national policy promoted communal cooperative approaches. That is what we are trying to do. Here's the list of those factors that they came up with, 21 of them. And as you can see, many of those factors would definitely or could definitely be impacted by offshore wind. And what we'd like to know is, in our scenario development for this first 3 gigawatts of offshore wind, how can the planning and deployment potentially result in net benefits to our West Coast fishing stocks and communities? So that's a quick overview of what we've got going on and our lens on what a just energy transition might look like. This is a photograph from the top of Humbug Mountain, looking south across actually Representative Smith's District 1. That's all I have for you all today. I'm happy to take questions if you have any. Brittany, is your hand still up? Or is this a new one?
Sorry, that's old. Let me take it down.
Okay, cool. Excellent hour.
Hey, Shannon, this is JP at the PUC, and I'm more interested on a personal level rather than for PUC. But in terms of like the ports infrastructure that might be developed and their engagement with offshore wind, what's been your experience thus far with their I guess a level of excitement about getting involved in this and like maybe building out their infrastructure? Just based on some of the past presentations, it seems like if wind were to come and it were to be, I guess, marshaled and then built out of the ports and then serviced, it'd be quite a bit of infrastructure. So just, I mean, on a personal level, just kind of curious about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it varies by port, definitely. Each of the ports has their own culture, certainly, as well as their infrastructure and plans. So we'll start at Coos Bay. Because there is a lot of focus and study looking there and looking at the potential for Coos Bay, honestly, for both Coos Bay and the Port of Eureka to provide marshaling services. When we talk about marshaling, that means, hey, this is kind of the hub of the deployment for this array that will eventually be put into place. There are 2 studies currently taking a deeper dive specifically into Coos Bay and understanding what are the limitations of existing infrastructure there, what are some of the different scenarios for marshaling roles that Coos Bay might play, and under those scenarios, what are the additional infrastructure developments that need to be seen. With respect to the level of excitement that
driving over there.
I'm going to go ahead and mute on. That kind of depends on where we are at in terms of determining exactly what footprint which industry will be using. There's definitely excitement from leadership at the International Port of Coos Bay for the decarbonization opportunities of offshore wind directly, and a lot of interest in supporting additional analysis of Coos Bay as a green hydrogen hub. And definitely offshore wind would be necessary for that. As we go down to the south, we see each of our ports along there. Once we have the offshore wind deployed, there's a lot of service that's required there. If we go all the way down to Brookings Harbor, there's a lot of interest in minimal investments that would probably be necessary for the infrastructure there, but a lot of investment in workforce development and an expansion of the fleet that will be necessary to service and maintain in place those deployments. So definitely a lot of excitement down there about workforce development. And then you've kind of got the whole spectrum of levels of interest with the ports in between there. So I hope that helps answer the question, JP. Cool. All right, you just asked that, so I didn't feel bad because nobody asked me any questions. Thank you. Okay, Jason Searman, I can see you. I can't hear you. And I'm wondering if you're ready to go.
Hey Shannon, yeah, I'm ready. I might turn my camera on for Q&A. I just want to save the bandwidth and make sure this all goes accordingly without a hitch. So let me try sharing my screen.
Sounds good.
Let me know if people can see some waves close to scene. Is that working?
Looks good.
Okay. So I gave a kind of recap on House Bill 2021 and House Bill 3375 to the BOEM Oregon Task Force last week. And that seemed to be just the right level of information for that audience. I know this is a different audience. Probably don't need to spend too much time, going through each of these slides. I gave some context on Odo, for example, but I'm happy to just walk through them again. And if there's any questions, obviously, let me know afterwards. But that's the intent, to get to House Bill 3375, but just give a little bit of context on clean energy, which is a big driver for offshore wind. So like I said, these are the quick topics I went over at the BOEM meeting. A little background on Oregon Department of Energy for anybody who's not familiar with us on this call. Our vision statement is leading Oregon to a safe, equitable, clean, and sustainable future. This used to be our mission statement, but that changed recently after going through a multi-year strategic planning effort. So our new mission statement is Oregon Department of Energy helps Oregonians make informed decisions and maintain a resilient and affordable energy system. We advance solutions to shape an equitable, clean energy transition, protect the environment and public health, responsibly balance energy needs and impacts for current and future generations. What we do is our position statement that supports how we achieve that mission, with 5 pillars kind of defining our work. Several of these pillars support our work related to offshore wind. For example, energy education and technical assistance, and providing a venue for problem solving Oregon's energy challenges. And I always like to give acknowledgement to Oregon's tribes. Our strategic plan also prioritizes many considerations surrounding diversity, equity, and cooperative engagement. And this includes acknowledgement of and engagement with the indigenous tribes and bands that have been part of the Northwest landscape and throughout Oregon for time immemorial. And then I gave an update on new legislation, basically that BOEM task force. So I feel like these slides were good because I think House Bill 2021 and the overall push for clean energy is a key driver for offshore wind and shapes the fundamental context for House Bill 3375. So Oregon's new 100% clean energy for all law, House Bill 2021, that significantly accelerated Oregon's need for new renewables and bolstered the regional commitment to clean energy. It commits the state's investor-owned utilities and electricity service suppliers to clean electricity targets that require specific reductions in their greenhouse gas emissions associated with the electricity that is supplied to Oregon customers. Those accelerated targets are 80% by 2030, 90% by 2035, and 100% by 2040. So I recognize the audience here is different than the BOEM crowd. We have PUC and Odo folks on the line. John Cornwell, I believe, is a colleague of mine who I saw is on the call. Some of these provisions relate to PUC work, some of them relate to Odo work, but House Bill 2021 basically included several other energy-related provisions, some relating to fossil fuel energy facilities, others tied to renewable energy, that aim to strengthen equity, resilience, and local job development for Oregon communities. So, some of these bullet points and highlight the provisions that are kind of stack up well with Shannon's presentation and some of the community needs. and wishes and wants and desires from our coastal communities. I don't know if I need to go through each of these, but happy to answer questions on them. Not all of them have a direct connection to offshore wind, but they all kind of fit in the landscape of the energy sector that offshore wind plays in. So definitely some connections. And then these next couple slides, this one kind of summarizes where Oregon fits in the Western interconnection, certainly with other Western states and their commitments to clean energy, but then also kind of summarizes some of the national commitments. Big takeaway here is kind of that highlighted box up in the Pacific Northwest. And I also threw in, not necessarily state commitments, but utility specific commitments. Idaho Power and Avista are also aiming to be 100% clean by 2045. So the bottom line takeaway, is that Oregon and many other states are looking for more resources for clean and renewable energy. This kind of sets up some work from the Power Council and their draft plan. I like these next couple visuals just to help give some context of kind of how much more renewable energy, clean energy resources need to be built over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So this visual is from the Power Council. That's a group that uses sophisticated modeling to inform regional power planning. The draft of their 2021 power plan is now available. And this graphic here shows the significant ramp up of the regional wind development from the mid-2000s to 2012, and then a leveling off. And then you can see the smaller additions of wind, but the rise of solar development also in more recent years. So this gives us kind of about 10 gigawatts of wind over this time period and 1 gigawatt of solar capacity that have been deployed in the Northwest. So kind of the next question is how much more, can we build? We already have lots of onshore. How much more of that can we get, recognizing that a lot of the good areas have already been taken. So this slide kind of looks forward. Another graph from the council helps us visualize the scale of the need for the new renewables that we'll need to accomplish all these clean energy commitments. They forecast 5 gigawatts of additional new renewable development needed by 2027, 14 gigawatts of additional renewables by 2040. These are really large numbers. They could grow even bigger depending on lots of factors: population growth, growth in electrification, data centers. Continually hearing how new data center contracts are being inked. Eastern Oregon, the Dalles area is growing with those. Impacts from climate change, like hotter summers, also would be a factor here. The council recognizes the scale of build out could be a challenge and identifies issues like cost, transmission availability, and siting challenges could all pose barriers to meeting the tremendous need here. So kind of again, bottom line takeaway from some of these slides and these visuals, a lot of people are asking here is, can it all get built in time? So with this uncertainty in mind, the power plan's urging further study of these challenges and for regional entities to work together towards solutions. The plan also recommends national labs, research institutions, trade allies, and utilities can continue to work with developers and manufacturers to research and explore the potential of emerging technologies. So this, getting back with offshore wind here, emerging technologies constitute offshore wind, certainly energy storage and other carbon-free resources, all of which can help us address these barriers to large-scale development of renewables. So that's kind of the context in my mind and how I like to frame up kind of state of play, I guess, before getting into House Bill 3375. But House Bill 3375, basically recognizes this challenge, recognizes the merits of studying offshore wind, huge potential, talks a little bit about Bowen's activity and the language of the bill, decarbonization, several other benefits and challenges are out there. It declares an Oregon goal to plan for up to 3 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2030. I kind of have thought of this as a goal to plan like a forward-looking, doesn't really give us specific direction of how to plan or who would be doing that planning, but the legislature could give further direction through future legislation on that. And this goal is intended to maximize state benefits while minimizing conflicts between floating offshore wind, the ocean ecosystem, and ocean users. And then the near term, more specific direction from that bill is for Oregon Department of Energy, myself, for the offshore wind study, we're calling it, that will result in a report to the Oregon legislature that identifies and summarizes key benefits and challenges of integrating this number 3 gigawatts of floating offshore wind into the grid, Oregon's grid, by 2030, and also identifying opportunities for future study and engagement. I kind of have this last bullet because there's a lot of state commitments out there and growing commitments, new states adopting new commitments to offshore wind. A lot of this is played out in the East Coast. We currently don't have any specific deployment targets from any of the West Coast states. California has a bill that's similar to HB 3375 that recently passed, AB 525. That one has a little bit more specific direction to the California Energy Commission for how that agency would develop a plan for offshore wind for California, and how that would kind of factor into state IRPs and work from California ISO, for example. So they have a little bit different flavor of offshore wind commitments in California. And then the East Coast states have specific, have committed to specific deployment targets in a lot of instances. So that's just to say that this one, House Bill 3375, is of a little bit different flavor. So the core elements of that bill are for Oregon Department of Energy to do a literature review relevant studies and reports relating to floating offshore wind to help us identify the key benefits and challenges, get involved with stakeholders, have a process that invites them in to give us feedback. The bill specifically lists several state, regional, and national entities. PUC, Oregon Public Utility Commission, is one of those. Some of the other folks on the call today are also listed, NREL, PNNL, for example. Other folks, state agencies are Department of Land Conservation Development, Business Oregon, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Other more regional entities are the Northwest Power Council, Bonneville Power, federal entities, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the national labs I already mentioned, and U.S. Department of Defense. So kind of a different perspectives from different stakeholders there. I think Department of Land Conservation Development, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and U.S. DoD would probably be more in the bucket of those folks that are interested in siting aspects, and then Business Oregon would probably be, interested in jobs and economic development potential, benefits and challenges with that. So just trying to give people here a little flavor of, I think, how the study will evolve and where people will be most interested in supplying feedback. A lot of the other entities, PUC specifically, are probably more interested in grid challenges, costs and benefits, and things like that. So I'm gonna design this study to give opportunities for feedback on a variety of topics that would be related mostly to the grid and energy and transmission issues, things like that, but also siting challenges, for example. So prompting questions. The plan for this is to build off that literature review. The literature review kind of serve as a common jumping off point for our stakeholder engagement to get everybody kind of grounded. And then I developed some prompting questions that would kind of target specific topics that were identified in the literature review to kind of draw out more feedback from stakeholders. But questions would relatively be open-ended, I would imagine, so that people could supply varying levels of feedback depending on their bandwidth or what they're interested in. And then we do that kind of fairly early on, an initial round of feedback gathering, and then I would design a couple public meetings in the new year in 2022 to kind of go through those questions, summarize the feedback we received, and then have opportunities for kind of group discussion, oral comments, to continue gathering feedback. And then by next summer, I would be in the phase of summarizing those key findings and generating a draft report, all to be finalized by September 15th of next year. And then here's links for, this. I recognize most people on this call are PC or ODO staff or other folks that may already be well tuned into this, but always good to have these links available for people to stay informed. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jason. Let's see. Does anyone have any questions? Go ahead and just unmute yourself. You're welcome to. Cool. Well, I guess we hit the mark. We've thoroughly exhausted all topics offshore wind or else identified additional topics for further inquiry. JP, I don't have anything. Whoops, is there a hand up? Let's see. Representative Brock Smith.
Thank you, Shannon. And I just wanted to thank everyone for all their efforts. Jason, appreciate the presentation. Love the presentation from NREL. And of course, just to note on the 3375 and the present, just to keep in everybody's minds, and the presentation back to the legislature in September of 22, so that we can prepare for, of course, budget cycles and investments from the state, any additional legislation to help move things forward, and all of the boxes checked, right, and moving forward. So appreciate all the work, and it's just really exciting to have an opportunity to move this concept forward in line with what President Biden and his cabinet is working on. So thank you.
All right, any additional questions? I will follow up with our presenters today and request those slide decks and get those back over to Rose and JP. And again, thank you very much to JP and Rose for allowing this to happen and facilitating and getting the word out. Really appreciate it. I think it's a timely topic, and hopefully you feel it was time well spent. And speaking of time, it looks like you've got a gift of 10 minutes early for your noon meeting or an early lunch. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Shannon. Really exciting
Thanks, Shannon.
topic.